let y'all know. Okay. All right.
Ready. All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ann Osterman. I am Dean of Libraries at George Mason University, and it is such a pleasure to welcome you all to this event. The libraries have such a great partnership with the Center for Humanities Research, and this is another great outcome of that partnership. We both care so much about open access in the humanities. We're so grateful to have you all here today. I'm going to introduce your moderator. Dr. Meg Meiman is the Associate University Librarian for Learning, Research, and Engagement here at George Mason University. Meg has experience working at many academic institutions, including Indiana University in Bloomington, University of Delaware, and the University of Southern Mississippi, to name a few, that have given her a broad perspective of the field. In addition to her master's degree in Library and Information Science, Meg has a PhD in English and Digital Humanities. We are so grateful to have her as our moderator today for this important topic to the humanities and to libraries.
Thank you, Ann. Good afternoon, y'all. Really happy you're here today. So as Ann mentioned, I'm the Associate University Librarian for Learning, Research, and Engagement, and I wanted to welcome all of you to the second of the two-part series, Open Access Publishing in the Humanities, Mapping the Terrain. And it's co-hosted by our libraries, George Mason University Libraries, and the Center for Humanities Research. So today's discussion, as part of the second in the two-part series, is Models for Scholarly Articles. And I'm joined by two leading open access publishers in the humanities. Before I want to introduce them, or y'all, I wanted to say that we're really happy to be partnering with the Center for Humanities Research because we've had the opportunity to really, I think, foster a sense of community around topics that are relevant to the humanities and to libraries. And we're really happy for this topic because it brings us together with something that we are all commonly interested in. The folks that love this partnership include the library's Dean, Ann Osterman, you just heard from, as well as Catherine Oline, the Associate Director for Center for Humanities Research, and Alok Yadav, the Center for Humanities Research Faculty Director, is also with us today. Just a quick word about the format before I introduce our speakers. After I introduce our speakers, we're going to start with a series of questions for Stephanie and Charlotte about open access in the humanities, and then we'll open up for a broader question and answer that will include obviously everybody here as well as everyone online. Our first speaker, Stephanie Kalin, is co-head of Library Sales Americas at Cambridge University Press. With nearly 20 years of experience in academic publishing, she leads strategic initiatives and supports sales teams across Canada, the Eastern United States, and Latin America. Her work includes developing collaborative, value-driven approaches that support transparency and trust between libraries and publishers. Our second speaker, Charla Lair, is the lead strategist for open scholarship at Lyrasis, where she shapes programs that help libraries and scholarly communication communities move toward a more open, equitable, and sustainable future. She manages the Lyrasis Open Access Community Investment Program, OACIP, which supports community-driven funding models rooted in transparency and collaboration. Through her work with OACIP and her service on several advisory boards in the global open access community, Charla strengthens shared understanding of open scholarship and fosters broader participation in models that center community needs and values. Our third speaker, Rebecca Seeger, I'm sorry to say cannot be here today. She is unwell. She actually momentarily lost her voice. And so she will not be with us today. And so while we do regret that, we are still very much excited to have Stephanie and Charlie here today. And I know we're going to have a really great discussion. So the first question that I wanted to ask you both, and either of you chime in however you like, is in the past 5 to 10 years, what disciplines have you seen really leaning into open access? And then the second part is, what disciplines do you think are still catching up and why? So maybe let's start with what disciplines you see as really leaning into open access.
And Stephanie, please go first as a publisher. I think you would have a little more insight into this, at least a broader insight, yeah.
Sure. So, I think maybe it's good to start sort of with some context, right? I think the work that Delta Think did sort of showed some of these trends. And about 10 years ago, I think 70% of humanities content was paywalled. Today, that number is about 50%. So I think, that shows meaningful progress in the humanities with regards to open access. And at Cambridge, we do think that more and more humanities scholars and societies are embracing change and looking at finding ways to ensure that research is accessible and as impactful as possible. Specifically at Cambridge, we do have a couple of case studies that might be useful to look at. So when societies like the Linguistic Society of America or the European Consortium for Political Research joined Cambridge recently, they joined and made the decision within their first year to flip their entire journal portfolio to open access. So what we're seeing is that scholarly societies are coming to publish specifically with Cambridge because they agree with our vision and direction of travel regarding open access, because they want to be open, because they want to be OA. Regarding disciplines that are still catching up, I think, it, because because of our approach and our commitment to becoming open, fully open within the next 5 or 6 years, um, we are we're not seeing this quite as much, but I think that, disciplines that are still catching up are those that in areas with little grant funding, right? So when it comes to dollars and cents, that's definitely impacts disciplines. I'll pass it on to Charlotte
Yeah.
then.
Oh, yeah, thanks. Yeah, so yeah, and I'm just going to go through a list in my mind of like linguistics. Absolutely. There are quite a few notable journals. I'm not sure how it might reflect or represent the entire discipline, but they are some of the more vocal within the open access movement, several linguistics journals now. But I would also add archaeology, anthropology, those disciplines, the particularly within performance, the musicology, both ethnomusicology and just musicology itself, are doing more in open access. Film studies, the same. Digital humanities, of course, that being born digital, they're more likely to embrace open access, but also media studies. And so those are the ones that have been really leaning in for this. But again, those are, I know this is talking about articles and journals, but you can't talk about humanities without talking about books. And in my mind, it's those disciplines where, money, of course, plays a role. You don't necessarily have the money, or, that APCs are not as prevalent necessarily within that because there was no funding body, an external funding body to support that level of funding. And so you're seeing these folks go to programs where there might be open access, and actually within the humanities, there's been more proliferation of support for books, publishing open access monographs, and that's where they're getting exposed to it more so, I think, than in the journal world. However, that is changing. I would also like to note that even though APC forms of open access having where there's a fee associated with publishing that, usually assigned to the author, without having a lot of funding bodies within the humanities, that hasn't been as prevalent, right? Because it's harder. It really does have to come out of the pocket in a lot of cases for those authors. A lot of humanities disciplines actually, and for decades now, actually have gone on the margins, actually have exited a lot of the commercial publishers, the large publishers, or even those family-owned trusted publishers within certain disciplines that are all over the globe. They're publishing their own journals through what's called Diamond Open Access. And so it might have a lot of volunteer labor, or it's a society who has, a couple journals that are Diamond Open Access. Those aren't always counted in the studies because they're not necessarily within discovery systems. So it's hard to see where those are. But that's where I'm seeing also proliferation of humanities research within that journal environment. And that's across all disciplines. But I haven't in the middle of a study now within the United States to kind of assess who those are. But I know at least with the Directory of Open Access Journals, DOAJ, the data that they have there of the roughly 600 journals that are published in the United States, over 60, almost 70% of those are humanities and social science journals. And so that's something where we're needing to understand more. There's a lot of invisibility within the space as to who is actually participating in open access.
Thank you. I really appreciate that answer. And I think for people who may not be aware or who might need a refresher, and I think you explained it towards the latter part of your answer, Charlotte, which I appreciate, is APC stands for Article Processing Charges, right? So it's what a journal would charge, often, what a journal would charge an author to publish, something open access. So, okay.
Can I also,
Please.
sorry, I just to add that I think, this might be useful context too, our sort of perspective as a journals publisher at Cambridge, how we see this sort of tension between disciplines and open access is, I think, mitigated by the fact that we are so committed to the transformative agreements as our sort of vehicle to become open. And so as a result, we have about 2,600 institutions worldwide that have transformative agreements right now. Hundreds of those are in the US. And so it lowers the bar for entry, right? Because it is no cost open for scholars from all disciplines, right? And where we're specifically seeing a lot of this sort of equity happen, right, is at smaller schools, especially liberal arts colleges, where lots of scholars there are able to make their articles open and no cost to them in a way that they would not have been able to afford before.
That's really important. I think I think both of you touched on this, but one other part of this question that I wanted to ask is, what obstacles do you see scholars facing in publishing their work as OA? You certainly cited cost. So I'm sure that's part of it. Would it be fair to say that maybe another obstacle might be that scholars, at whatever point they are in their career, but especially maybe younger scholars, maybe like the culture of their particular discipline that they're in doesn't really easily accommodate that or value that. So I guess, what obstacles do you see that that scholars are facing, I think, in making their work open access? And we can start, Stephanie, we'll start with you.
Sure. I think, obviously funding remains a primary obstacle, but there's lots of other obstacles, including sort of confusion around open access, and their options, the perceived risk around predatory publishing, right? Like, is this real? Is this something that I can trust? And so, I think that, we've done a lot in this space to sort of inform and educate and get people comfortable, but I think there's still some work to do there as well.
Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, there are a lot of obstacles, but and I think part of that might be what stage of career that you're in. However, I think that's going to change after a while. There are tenure and promotion, right? There are requirements, and some are more friendly towards open access than others because they have gone through that demythification process, right? They analyze the myths, they understand what's a myth and what is truth. There's also, choice. Scholars need to have a choice of where they want to publish, what journal community they want to contribute to. And not all of them are open access. And that weighs more for them to be in the community they want to talk to and have that discourse with than if it's open. And so you're given, sometimes opposing options, and you have to choose one or the other based on whatever your priorities are, depending on whatever research you're doing and what the point was, who your audience was. For those who enter into it, where they're wanting to talk more and kind of as a social impact scholar, in the sense of that they're really wanting their research to be part of a larger conversation outside of the academy, then they're more likely to want to do something that's open access, or something that feels more low cost to them, or whatever, or that journal that feels very popular, and that they think they might have more readers. And so it's understanding that how I don't know if we're asking the right questions in a lot of ways, right? And that when you start that research, you have to think of that audience first, and then to understand what options are available. Is it getting in that high impact factor journal? Is that going to reach the audience you want? Or to even know that open access could be an option, that would get into, tenfold the number, more so. I mean, whenever content becomes open access, the number of views and downloads goes up exponentially. And so again, but for those scholars that doesn't matter, it's not a barrier, it's a choice. They don't necessarily care for it to be, because it was a matter of curiosity that they were following. It was a matter of wanting to speak to a specific cohort within their community, and they know this is the journal that's the one, and it doesn't have to be open access because they're pretty much reaching all the scholars they wanted to reach in the first place. Okay, that's fine. It's again, it's those obstacles are a lot more complex than what I think we're often realizing. It's not just about money. It's about choice in the end. And we could talk about the myths and all of that too, and that weighs into that. But I know that's a later question that kind of touches on that. So
You actually, I was going to say, and I sorry to spring this on you both now, but like I think we can take these questions a little bit out of order. Spoiler alert for everybody here and online. I sent the questions ahead of time to the speakers because these are hefty questions. I want to give you all time to think. But Charlotte, you mentioned something that made me think. I actually wanted to ask you both, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think it sounds like thinking about audience is one of the things that you would want, maybe both of you would wish scholars knew about open access. In other words, thinking about audience is maybe probably one of the first questions to think about, or certainly I think one of the primary ones. And okay, and you're nodding, Charlotte, so I will take that as a yes. But are there other aspects? I think you started to touch on these maybe implicitly in your answer, Charlotte, but do you both, what else do you wish scholars knew about open access? Like if they're thinking about that, I mean, certainly audience is one. I was wondering if you had any other thoughts. Charlotte, do you want to go first?
yeah, I mean, so I think audience is the big one, and I'll just say that again, that when being trained, I mean, like even in grad school, you're presented a lot of ways as being indoctrinated within the practices of your discipline. That's part of that educational process that you're going through as you go through graduate school. And you're not always asking a lot of why. You just know this is what I have to do to be able to get to that degree that gets me to that job. And then when you're in that job, it's what gets you into tenure and the promotion process and all of that. But for those who, whatever passion that drove them there in the first place, because boy, it has to be there, right? Because it's a lot you have to go through, kind of suffer through to be able to do it. Oftentimes it's because people love that discipline, and in a lot of ways it's not because it just stays in their head and it's just interesting. It's because they love the conversation, they love the exchange of the knowledge, they love being in there, and some will even go further, building on top of that knowledge. Some will go further in that they want to make the world a better place with that knowledge and how they contribute to like the world's global challenges, all of that, and humanities fits in that. Very much so. In fact, it's often missing in those conversations. And I think it's because it's not open access in a lot of ways now. Because it wasn't well funded to begin with. So it's already hard to publish. It's already hard to get that information even within a paywalled environment. And then if you want to make that open, if we made that open, I think the humanities would be in a lot more of those solutions, because it would fall in the hands of policymakers and decision makers. But you also have to keep in mind, we're not just talking about that. There are a gob of independent scholars that are out there that are not affiliated with institutions. They do not have access to this information when it's paywalled. They have to buy it outright, title by title, journal by journal, in order to access it. You also have these folks who just really love topics. My son he's in high school. He loves linguistics. He looks at those open access journals. He's not looking at any of those others. What does that mean? He's only getting a small piece of the conversation that's going on within that discipline. And that's a real shame. And so thinking about, I wish they've thought about audiences a lot more and understanding not the existing audiences in a paywalled environment, but the potential audience in an open access environment. And they still have a choice because their audience may be within that paywalled environment. That's okay. There's wonderful scholarship that serves the discipline well in that way. But if you want to stretch more, and I alluded this, I didn't follow the thought through in my last comment, younger scholars are being taught about open access. They're being taught, my son was taught about DOAJ in high school. They're going to be entering the academy expecting things to be open and not understanding why that the only way they can do it is through the proxy at the library, that they can't get it anywhere else. Information is prevalent, it's everywhere. And why is this not? And I think that's going to shift over the next generations where even the younger, early career researchers are going to start demanding this more. And so the barrier, I think, might flip in some ways or completely move, that it won't matter anymore what stage you're in. It's about who your audience is.
Stephanie, did you have anything to add?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think that I think Charlotte was absolutely right that, that it's humanities research is so important to be reflected in the open access space. Humanities research should be read and debated and used and engaged with by society as much as the sciences, right? And so that sort of readership, also the readership piece is so important. We have a case study of an archaeology journal. I think Charla had mentioned archaeology as one of those sort of early adopters within the disciplines. And we saw an archaeology journal that within the first year after their flip, the OA articles saw 50% more usage than articles behind a paywall. That's a huge increase, right? That really just shows that there is an appetite, right, outside of those sort of expected readership circles, right? So I also think that, what other persistent like sort of myths exist? I mean, I think, there's the ones that we talk about all the time, right? That OA means lower quality. That is not necessarily the case if you are sort of working within, sort of journals and publishers that have um, uh, that are sort of respected and OA does not necessarily equal predatory publishing, right? These things are not synonymous. Um, but I also think that this sort of this landscape, OA terminology and models feels overwhelming to lots of people, right? We work in this space and it feels overwhelming to us. And this is our job to sort of deal with this stuff every day, So I think that it's there's some work to be done in terms of sort of getting everybody comfortable. But I think that the reasons that there's confusion is because it is a confusing time, that there's the pace of change is significant, right? And it takes our brains a little while to catch up.
Well said. I just realized that I do have kind of a question about AI at some point, but I'm not going to spring that on you just yet. Let's wait and see if the conversation leads us there a little bit more. I think I was thinking about it, and again, I think you both touched on this in your answering this most recent question about, like what are some like common misunderstandings or what do you wish people knew? And I think you were talking about audience. And I think Charlotte in particular, you touched on this about, the way that you're seeing open access, I think will become more important or I think less of a cultural shift perhaps. But it's certainly, yeah, I think more important among current and future scholars, especially younger scholars. In the next 10 years, what do you see is coming up, I think, in the industry overall? So like, for example, like what percentage of articles do you think that we might see overall in open access publishing in the humanities? And again, understanding that with humanities, really the books are really highly valued within the humanities as well. But like, what do you see as coming up in the industry? I think more read and publish agreements, like what you were saying before, more transformative agreements. What do you see as coming up? Charlotte, you look like you have an answer. Yeah.
Yeah, and okay, so predicting even the end of this year is really hard right now, right? So take this all with a grain of salt. So some of this may be wishful thinking, but trying to ground it in what I know. I think we're going to see a massive internationalization of humanities, and I think we're going to see this across all disciplines, but particularly in humanities. I mentioned Diamond Open Access. There are several tens of thousands of Diamond Open Access journals in the world. Diamond Open Access means that it's free to read and free to publish. And so what these are, and what some people often think is, this is some scholar who just got fed up with the traditional publishing and they went in their garage and they started their own journal. That's kind of the image of this, more myths. That's not the case. In a lot of cases, these are sponsored journals. So these come out of academic departments. These are at university presses. These are within societies, within government agencies. They're within libraries who have library publishing programs. It means that all the costs are paid for, that they don't have to charge for revenue to come in order for it to be published. There are many of these journals that are not as professionalized because they don't have money coming in to pay for a lot of the bells and whistles that we've gotten used to, particularly with large commercial publishers and their fancy platforms and all the different things you can do. And it's a lot of it's volunteer labor. However, this has been around for decades, just so you know. It's not new. And in fact, it even started in a print form with sponsored journals that were being paid for by someone else so that the journal itself was free. It could just be mailed out to everyone without a cost. And so it's not new, but it is the challenge with it is it's not within the traditional systems that the publishing industry and the libraries often use to find the journals. They're not in the indexes. They're not in discovery systems. And so it's really easy to think they don't exist at all. But again, there are tens of thousands of these around the world. And particularly in the last 5 years, Europe, the European Commission, so the EU government has been investing millions of euros into developing what they're calling the European Diamond Capacity Hub. And it's in service of all EU countries plus the UK in support of providing education, standards, platforms, and to have that as a hub for the whole EU, but to also help support at country levels so that there are folks on the ground who are supporting scholars locally, but that it's discoverable at the EU level. And so that has happened, but now they've connected to systems that already exist in Central and South America, and they're connecting with systems that are forming in Africa. And there's a project now that the European Commission is funding to help them connect all of that. So it's a matter of time where they're going to get enough investment, because most of these are invested by their national governments. That's how they're being sponsored. They're not being paid for by institutions like how we do things in the United States. But they're now getting their own systems. They're creating avenues for these journals to be put into the indexes themselves. And we're going to start seeing them more and more and more. And in Southeast Asia, they also have a large diamond community. It's tens of thousands that are there, like in particularly Indonesia. Again, I think we're going to see more of that internationalization. So everybody's talking about China, but I think it's the whole rest of the world. We're just going to see a lot more. And it's a matter, and it'll all be open access. So the question is then for those humanities scholars within the United States, if you're not doing open access, you will become more invisible because everyone else is going to be more visible, more accessible, more part of that conversation. So that's what I see in the next 10 years is that. And then, you mentioned AI, that along with other geopolitical forces that are going on that I don't think are going to go away with just a simple election. I think it's a worldwide struggle. We're going to go through this era of, where things get closed for other reasons, not because of how things are paid. With this internationalization, people are going to, reject that and want to swing the other way because it looks scary and uncertain. So we'll probably start seeing things also, more barriers come up. So I feel like we're going to go back and forth, but the trend is going to be that this conversation is going to, and the readers are going to become a lot more international. And that's the big thing that I see.
Stephanie, since you're with Cambridge, what kind of trends, I think, do you see like from your vantage point too? Or you can comment on what Charlotte said too, either one.
So I mean, I think everything that Charles said was really interesting. I think from our perspective from sort of a publisher perspective, so I'm not sure that I can speak for other publishers, but so at Cambridge, we've already made a strategic commitment to become fully open access within the next 6 years, right? But I'm not sure. I think that some of the evidence that we've seen from sort of the landscape on a whole might not actually support full transition at many publishers, right? I think that there is a lot of investment in this sort of mixed economy. There's where there's open access is available, but also where we are also sort of generating revenue through traditional subscriptions, right? I think that, especially at commercial publishers, it's really difficult to walk away from those revenue sources, right? Being a sort of not-for-profit university press, we're able to sort of make non-commercial decisions. So we're in sort of a privileged position that way. I also think, over the next 10 years, in my view, it sort of also depends on like how the funding sort of shakes out, right? What governments decide. I think, we know that it was governments that sort of driving early open access, right? Our own government here in the US is sort of on the fence, right? Like it's good, but also we're not going to actually fund it. And I think that, like with like sort of financial money problems are real, right? Publishers have them, universities have them, right? And so what we're seeing from in sort of the library space too is that while lots of libraries would love to support open access as much as they can, it really depends on whether they can when it comes down to dollars and cents, right? So I think, altruism is not going to sort of drive this change. I think that we need more structural changes to drive change at a sort of higher level, and that's going to include funding.
And even, I guess, maybe like the structural changes, that you were talking about, Charlotte, with the European Diamond Capacity Hub. Were you going to say something, Charlotte?
Yeah, I actually wanted to add on that because Stephanie inspired another idea in the sense of, a lot of people don't really actually question what is open access in the sense of we say that it means it's free to read. And then what happens, as far as who pays for it, that's all up in the air and all the different colors and and all of that. But nobody ever talks about what that means to a publisher. And I just want to say that really clearly. So in a paywalled environment, you publish something, the author submits the article, it gets through the peer review process, and then it's all packaged up and ready to go, copy edited, all of that. And then the publisher distributes that and says, give me money so you have access to it. So everybody thinks you're paying for access. That money is not just so they can click a button and have the IP address and have that turned on. That's a lot of money to pay for somebody to do that, to enter in the number and make it turn. The money is going to all of what happened before. It's going to pay for all of the platforms. It's paying for all the labor. It's paying for all of the publishing. So we've been paying for publishing in that paywalled environment all along. It's just been masked around in this And what works in procurement systems within institutions, you're paying to get this thing turned on so you can look at it. But that's not what you were paying for. In an open access environment, all those same things happen. That's why the myth of it being less quality is silly. Like Stephanie was saying, it's about the quality of the publisher. It's about the quality of the processes and best practices that publisher chooses to use in order to publish. And so open access, what that does is it does all those same things, except you have to give them the money up front. They can't go and get all the money after the fact because for access, because you can keep selling it for access to get more and more money to pay for that publishing. But in open access, you need the money up front in order to do all of those things. It's a very generalized way of looking at it, but it's about where the money enters in. And I always tell people to really think about what this means to the publisher. It's like when you get a new job, you're really excited about it, but you've learned you have to work a whole month before you're even going to get that first paycheck. And and you don't and all of a sudden you're like, oh no, I have to shift everything around to make sure that I'm able to do that. This is why the movement's been slow, because publishers who have, like Cambridge has a whole lot of products and services that it provides to libraries, but also to the scholars themselves. Their budgets are all entangled in all of this expected revenue that comes in, and to shift that around, just like it is to shift whenever you pay your bills because you have this new job, you're not going to get paid for 4 weeks or even 6. It's a real problem. And so when we talk about money, I think there's going to be a contraction all around. It's not just around open access, but it's for the paywalled content too. Right now, the austerity measures in the United States, a lot of subscriptions are actually going away. Memberships, they're all getting canceled. They're doing a lot of emphasis on open access, but they're being very specific about which ones. And not just because of how it serves their institution, but also what's fair. Cambridge, they have a very fair transformative agreement, very neutral, really easy for any kind of library to be able to do. That's an easy yes, right? And so, but for others, they're saying no. So, and it's because everything is contracting. So I agree with Stephanie on this one. The money and the even in the next 10 years, what is it going to look like at an institutional level in our country, but also globally? And as we're also asking publishers to switch to a whole new way of getting that money into their business to be able to do what they want to do at that high quality level. It's really hard.
Yeah, oh, go ahead. Stephanie, did you want to say? Yeah.
Sure. I was just going to follow up on that. I mean, so the sort of like, this is one of my favorite misconceptions to unpack about sort of OA being free, right? Because open access is free to read, but is not free to produce, right? And in fact, as Charla has sort of laid out here, publishing, the sort of process of publishing is more complex than ever when you sort of lay open access on top of it, right? As Charla sort of pointed out that, many of the processes are the same, right? And should be, obviously, right? So the decision to publish open access comes after the decision to accept an article, right? We don't publish articles because they're open access. We publish them because they are quality, right? Because they are worthy of being published, and then the decision to publish open comes after that. But there are all these sort of added, what would we have found sort of as a 500-year-old sort of glacially slow moving institution, Cambridge University Press, right? Until fairly recently, we learned that actually with open access, things have to move really fast, right? And that there are lots of workflows that need to change, right? And that every journal having their own peer review process, by the way, like doesn't work toward creating the kind of the kind of scale that you need to achieve, right, in order to make publishing open access cost efficient, right? In order to make it and to do it at scale, right? So there are sort of added costs associated with OA that that are also that are real and that we're dealing with, but I think it's something that's worth noting.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for answering that kind of crystal ball question. Because I mean, it's obviously always really impossible to predict the future. But I think just to kind of I'll summarize a little bit, I think, of what you were saying. What really struck me is that I'm thinking of it in terms of almost like a push and pull a little bit, because you've got, what you were saying earlier, Charla, about this increased internationalization and still seeing, despite, I think, a lot of significant challenges, the trend generally going up towards the internationalization of humanities scholarship. But then I think, as you both mentioned too, there's financial considerations, which are huge, both I think among any kind of university or library or anybody who would have a financial stake in or contribute to this. They're experiencing financial challenges, and then you've got I think probably too. I think the current overall perhaps lack of a robust infrastructure. I mean, there's a really wonderful example that you cited, Charla, of again, going back to the European Diamond Capacity Hub, but it sounds like having certainly like that kind of infrastructure, among other things, that kind of infrastructure is absolutely needed as well as what you were saying, Stephanie, which is really helpful to think about too, that from the publisher side, thinking about being able to become much more agile, on the publishing side and standardizing some things that really need to be standardized to get OA going or to match the pace of OA. Whereas before, I think, the pace could be a bit slower, or I think glacial in your terms, but yeah, so which I think is a good term. So I think we're getting actually close to time for an open Q&A. So I'd like to go ahead and open it up for questions. So first of all, I mean, I'm going to give you profuse thanks at the end, but thank you so much for answering these questions so far. I think this has been a really fantastic discussion. But I'd like to open it up for Q&A. Yeah, and we've got one person here, and then we'll check the chat too. But go ahead, ask your question.
Maybe we can do introductions as well. Just say sort of you're a graduate student, or it might be helpful to get some context.
Oh, sure, yeah.
That would be great.
Ashley Williams, doctoral student, Department of History. So this has been really great because this is not even, I don't think, something I've actually had the opportunity to sort of sit with and think about. And so this question, maybe it's kind of simple, but I was just curious, Stephanie, what you talked about at the end there, as far as how these things don't work at scale. And so I'm curious, what would that fix be? Like, what are these institutions or these publishers thinking about how that might change? Specifically, like, I thought it was really interesting what you said about each journal having their own peer review system and how that doesn't necessarily work at scale. And then also going back to that myth of like, oh, that means that the articles that are being published are not necessarily that great, or whatever the case may be, like that myth, right? So I'm just curious, like, what is the fix, I guess?
So thanks so much for your question. I think so. The thing is that we are sort of meeting the challenge of scale, right? That's something that's really, really important. I think that for us to be sustainable, for this transition to be sustainable for Cambridge University Press, right? We need to meet that challenge. And so we're doing it by sort of going back and looking at all the ways in which where we can find efficiencies, right? And so some of the context that might be helpful is that Cambridge University Press publishes on behalf of lots of scientific scholarly societies, right? And one of the things that these societies really loved about collaborating with partnering with Cambridge in the past was that level of sort of customization, right? The personal touch that Cambridge was able to give to these societies. In some of those ways, it was like, well, then you can keep whatever sort of whatever process you use, right? Whether that process is on a peer review on a platform, right? Or peer review using spreadsheets or emails, like so. But what we are finding is that we're having to sort of go back to those societies and say, listen, we need to do this at scale. We need to be more efficient, and we need to bring everybody along with it in order for us to successfully transition a diverse journals list, right? And that means, and this is even more important for the humanities, right? Because in our view, the sciences will sort of flourish outside of sort of our commitment, right? But where we see where we can add a lot of value as Cambridge is to make sure that that we're committing to all disciplines, to making this possible for all disciplines, right? Did that answer your question, or did I get sidetracked?
Yeah, I think so. I guess then the answer to my question is really, I think you did answer, just like this standardization, becoming more efficient, finding ways in which you might be able to save costs and things like that. So yeah, I think you did. Thank you.
One thing that might also be useful too is another way that we're sort of thinking about cost containment too is by, and this might be controversial for some of the people in the room, is by sort of eliminating print from our journal, from all of our journals, right? And this has been a really, really hard one for lots of folks, right?
Yep.
But the truth is that print runs are very, very expensive, and they're getting more expensive. It is very costly to ship a journal across the world, right? And so this is a way that we're finding ways to sort of be more efficient.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, Alok, yes, and also we have Alok Yadav here, who's the head of Center for Humanities Research, and I'm so sorry, actually, I was supposed to let you kick off your name.
Yeah, we're happy to join in as the
Yes.
question and discussion is going on. I'm really intrigued by several things that were raised in the earlier part of this discussion, and have several questions, but I'll just start with one, which relates to this issue of how open access publishing is situated in relation to the rest of the open internet. Right, so this kind of sense that open access materials are free to read makes them look similar to other kinds of material that you can encounter on the internet that is free to read, free to access, and that kind of thing. And that, I think stands behind a lot of the concerns or myths or confusion, the fuzziness about the nature of open access publications as opposed to other materials that might be available on the internet. Through that might even have a kind of clearly scholarly shape to them. Things that haven't yet gone through a peer review process in the preprint kind of phase, or materials uploaded to institutional repositories. So they have an association with an academic kind of space, but aren't necessarily published materials in the same kind of way as open access published stuff, or materials that scholars upload to their personal websites. All of these kinds of things. So I don't just mean the sort of extra academic internet, but I mean the spaces on the internet that might seem to have a kind of scholarly profile to them, but aren't actually publications in the same kind of sense that open access publications are publications. And so I'm curious about, from your respective vantage points, how you think about that relationship. So is it important to sort of mark the difference between open access publications and these other kinds of materials that are available freely on the internet? Or is there a synergy in kind of building associations and connections and channels between open access publications and these other kinds of parts of the ecosystem of openly available scholarly-ish materials?
Stephanie, if you don't mind, this is something actually I've been thinking a lot about lately. We have an issue of trust right now within the academy and of research, especially in our country, but it is a global phenomenon. And how do we build that trust back? That's kind of what your question seems to be asking, is what's trusted and what's not, and how do you signify trust? There are certain practices that for peer-reviewed content, for publishers, and Stephanie can speak to this too, when there are certain best practices that are established, like you need to have the license very clearly noted on like the front page of on the HTML, to say this is a Creative Commons license, right? And it has to be very clearly stated on the front page of every single one, or on the PDF. Not all of those are being followed. These rules are being followed, but that is the standard. And so, there are certain things publishers do to show their branding, because it's not just that it's written by a scholar from a certain institution. The publisher brand means something too. Cambridge University Press is very well respected around the world in many disciplines, and whenever their name is attached, that adds that level of trust, which is why it's so important for scholars to choose their publishing partner wisely, not just in the journal community that they're participating in, but the publisher, and what best practices and what reputation they might bring. That's important. But where I see this getting really gray is, like you mentioned, in the preprint servers with AI, and also with this impetus of public writing, that scholars are asked to do more and more to show, that how they're invested in knowledge mobilization, which is, moving from the academy into the public sphere. And what are they doing? Are they doing podcasts? Are they doing blog articles? Are they writing in, these various different places that are not publishers and not peer reviewed, but they are the experts, and they're basing it off of something they did publish. It's a way of getting that knowledge out there to other audiences. So I think these lines are going to blur even more, which I feel like falls back to the publisher. And then, Stephanie, I'd love to hear what you think as far as how to make very transparent that this went through a peer review process, and then make sure the metadata underneath. So this digital object and all of the data that's underneath to describe it, all of the PIDs, like the orchids, the roars, anything that's identifying the scholar, the institution, any of these unique IDs are attached to all of this, so it's trackable, it's findable. You can find the source, you can cite it. I wish there were regulations on AI so that it was always cited, and they're doing better with that, but there's no standard. It's those kinds of things that I think we're going to have to invest a lot more in to help build that trust, while also doing the things like what Stephanie is talking about, is standardizing things to get folks working at scale, so the publisher can then have time to focus on those things instead of all of that bespoke hand-holding that they were doing before.
Yeah, so this question of trust is really, really important to us at Cambridge. And I think, like at Cambridge, our legitimacy and rigor comes from structures that are deeply academic and deeply principled and connected to the way that our university sort of informs everything that we do, right? So that is one, like, rigorous peer review, right? And then I think, also sort of research integrity is so important right now, right? Being able to reassure the community, reassure readers, reassure anyone sort of investing in this landscape that um, that that everything that we produce has integrity, that editorial decisions are based solely on academic merit. This is a big one with open access, right? That things are not being published because they're being paid for, but they're being published because they are worthy. Um, we at Cambridge, we have a sort of managing journals publications integrity project to protect against fraud, and to detect content fabrication, right? So that we are sort of detecting things before it gets too far. We also have a really clear stance on AI. Obviously, it shouldn't have to be said, but obviously, we do not accept anything authored by AI. And then we also do not use author work to train to train AI without those authors' express permission. So I think that doing it is on us as publishers to prove, to show, to demonstrate that we're doing everything that we can, that that we are producing quality and worthy content, and that we're not allowing sort of we're not allowing the things that could happen, with AI and with other kinds of fraud, to impact our journals.
Great, thank you. Maybe we can go to David and.
Absolutely. David, did you want to vocalize your question? I wasn't sure. Okay. Hold on. And if you briefly give us your job title too?
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is David Habron. I'm the Director of Discovery Services here at the GMU Library. So I oversee like our metadata operations. And I will definitely admit that I'm not the most well-versed in the whole OA ecosystem, but I was very intrigued by how much you were pointing to like the importance of discovery and how these materials are made discoverable and how they may or may not be indexed, and some of these initiatives like the EU one that you were referencing to kind of be able to capture more of that. And so I'm sort of wondering like if you want to talk more about that topic and also like what we as an institution or similarly positioned institutions like could be doing to make them more discoverable, especially as well like tying that into what Alok was bringing up too about like all of this stuff and like the sort of more gray literature that like is or isn't getting captured but is increasingly becoming more scholarly significant in a scholarly way. And so sort of my concern here as well is that there is more and more content, scholarly content being put out that is more um like decentralized and it's not being captured in the same ways. And if there isn't like governmental investment in or some sort of investment, institutional investment in doing that, you just end up with a lot of mess. And like with AI factoring into the picture there, that gets even messier. And so I'm just sort of like, how do we think about that? But also just as an actual institution here, how do we think about making things more discoverable?
Yeah, and honestly, I don't have an answer. If I did, I'd probably get really rich. But I mean, it is a wild west, and I've seen presentations where they show all of this primary source material, the gray literature, all the white papers, policy documents, all of these different things that are just all over the place. And the question is, especially as a librarian, thinking about, well, our whole role is about making sure that we provide the access to the information that everybody needs. But then as a librarian, you also think, oh, there's only so much we can do. We can't buy everything. And even with open access, not all of it is good. Not all the paywall, that stuff is good either. And so you find yourself becoming the gatekeeper again in a lot of ways. Although we like to call it now curation, because I think there's a lot more thoughtfulness that goes into it than just closing it off. But you have your reasons, you have your policies in place and very transparent and always analyzing them over and over again as things change, so that you're always evaluating that. But how to make it all accessible? I don't think any institution is going to be able to. It comes down to, and your institution in particular, you belong to several consortia. So, I mean, you can look at this institutionally, and you should, but for something so big like this, this kind of question, it needs to be communities of libraries, I think, that are thinking of this. And so with GMU, you're members of Viva. a wonderful community to be able to start thinking about this as statewide, where you can maybe get some state money, so long as our governor here is, kind. But this idea of, yeah, I know, fingers crossed. But this whole idea of how that community, or even even a little smaller peer institutions within that community, and talking about this. But then there are other consortia that you belong to that are taking different approaches, have different communities, different strategies. And that makes it actually in some ways even more complex though, right? Because then you're having to think about multiple scales of priority. And what is going to serve you at the end of the day, you're responsible for who you serve. And making sure that what you are doing is aligning with all of that and what makes sense. I think it would help a lot if we could have a larger community looking at this. We always talk about shared collections, where we cost share, so we're not all buying all the same things. Anything that we can share, we're putting a fraction of the amount of money, and allows more to have access because you're doing this group cost share approach. Can't we do that with open access? And I don't mean in paying for it. I mean, I do, but that discovery piece, though, I think is even more important. I work with some publishers and I'm sure Cambridge would do the same thing. If you can't pay for it, can you at least still download their MARC records of the open content so that you still have access to that? Yes, you can. You should be able to. So whatever you can't pay for, you can still make discoverable within that open access environment. Indexes like DOAJ and DOAB are supposed to help with this. But even then, DOAJ, like I said, I'm doing this study in the US, only about 600 journals are showing up, but I've learned from my friends in Canada who did a similar study several years ago, that's probably only a third or even less of what diamond journals are in the United States because they are not visible. I would say start at home. So David, what you were asking, what publishing is happening on your campus? And I don't mean, who's publishing at Cambridge and who's publishing at Elsevier. That's important to know. And you can usually get that, especially if you're subscribers, and you can get that information. But who has their own journal on campus? Do you know, are there any academic departments or research centers that are publishing? Are you aware of that? Or are there any independent scholars who are scholars who have independent journals that they're publishing? Do a census on campus, find out what's happening, find out who's making the gray literature, find that, make it discoverable, put it in the repository, do all of these, if that's what that was there for in the first place, right? How do you, make sure it's in your document, in your CRIS systems, all of this. Find out what's happening, do a census at a local level, and then talk about it through those different communities that you all belong to. And then say, we did this. And they might go, oh, we could do the same thing. And then that starts conversations where they can maybe do some shared work for those smaller institutions who don't have the staff to do that. Maybe they could come together and do something. I mean, it doesn't have to necessarily come down to each individual institution. We as librarians are really good at collaboration. And so these are some of these questions we should be asking. How do we do this in a way like what Stephanie was talking about with scaling? How do you scale? And a lot of times it comes with standardization and collaboration and a little bit of centralization, at least of the labor that's taking it on, but also maybe how you disseminate so others can learn from what you did. But again, you may not want to make it all visible. We find that otherwise then the library becomes just like the internet and it's just everything. And that's not the value that I think libraries can bring.
As you were talking, Charlotte, I was thinking metadata wants to be free was the first thing that popped into my head. And then the other one was I was immediately thinking of the digital, the DPLA. And their kind of model and approach for primary historical sources and having something analogous to that happening among libraries. Again, and not to, but that's kind of alighting a lot of the complexity and the challenges in coordinating all of it. So yeah, Stephanie, I'm afraid, did I cut you off? I wasn't sure if you wanted to add anything as well, or if you had any thoughts, so.
No, I don't think I have anything particularly useful to add about metadata, but yeah, I mean, I think that like from a publisher perspective, we would love to figure out a way that all of our open access would be more, across the board, right? That all open access is more discoverable. I think that would make all of us very happy.
Totally. Yeah. Oh, yeah, Ashley.
This is actually not for me. All of the students that were here were all doctoral students with the history department. And so they had a question and they had to go. So they asked me to ask, but they wanted to know, we've been having a lot of discussion as doctoral students, thinking about jobs that we can go into, things that are non-traditional if we don't want to go the traditional route. And so a few of them wanted to know how you might get hired in thinking about like open access publishing, especially we're all like a part of the Digital Humanities Center here at Mason. So that's where they actually went. So they're thinking about those types of things, and then just asked if it's something that like the field itself is growing.
I'm happy to start on this one. This is one of my favorite topics. So I started at Cambridge out of college as a journals assistant a million years ago. I won't even say how many. It's so sad. But so I think, I looked for jobs in publishing because I was an English major, right? And thought, I love books, and what better thing than to read books all day? And then I started working for an academic publisher and definitely was not reading books all day, right? But I ended up in sales, and if you had asked me when I was 22, was I going to end up in sales, I would have said there was no chance in the world that I would become a salesperson, right? And I think that there are so many people that I know who are in this industry who also work in sales, who also would not have expected themselves to end up in this job. You possibly in the field, but definitely not in the job. And I think that like what it came down to for me was, one, Cambridge was this wonderful place full of really smart people, kind and smart, right? And so you find your people. But I think also in my job, I got to talk to librarians all day long, and that is not a burden, right? You get to sort of talk to librarians and problem solve. And I think, um, there's there's a lot of different places that your skills and your passion can take you that are sort of not expected, that are unexpected to you. And so I would, I would just encourage you to talk to lots of people about their jobs and about like what's out there and what's possible. I'm not sure that I think, OA in publishing is certainly a growing field, right? Um, I don't know that scholarly publishing in general is a growing field, right? But folks who are smart and have expertise in these areas are definitely in demand.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll add, I'm not a publisher. I'm a librarian, but I work at a library consortium. So like if we were talking about, where it's a centralized office that serves a community of libraries. And my role is actually mostly licensing. So I negotiate license terms and pricing with folks, but through the years, I keep doing more with open. And I don't say open access. My title recently changed to open scholarship, which is a term. There's open knowledge, open scholarship, open research, and then open science. And open science was the first of that iteration. They're all trying to say the same thing, but different disciplines prefer different things. I work with a lot of university presses, so I just decided I better not say open science. And the term science actually is the German term, which actually means research. It doesn't mean specifically STEM fields, but it gets confused because, language.
But German is so,
yes,
I know.
Yeah, exactly. And so I'm sharing a link, and this is one of the best sources for this, but open access is just about the content being open, but there's a whole world of open that is out there. There's open data, there's open infrastructure, There's open educational resources. There's just and then there's just the whole overarching of open research practices. How to make everything open peer review. They just add open to everything. And with the idea that through the entire research life cycle and beyond, out into that public sphere of getting into like citizen science or participatory science, where you're engaging with communities in your actual community and not just providing data, but being a part of that research process. How do we make it more open? So I would tell your colleagues, go there and look at the language that is being said. And there are all kinds of new programs, infrastructures. A lot of it's happening in Europe right now. Go to the Netherlands, anything Netherlands, they're doing amazing things around this whole open science realm, on campus and off. But it's a matter of, you can stay in the academy, but not necessarily as a scholar. You could be working in the research office. You can work with extension offices if you're for public land grant institutions that support that. There are a lot of amazing ways to use your skills that you're learning right now around research and within your discipline, and practices around, qualitative, quantitative data, all of that could be applied very well in this new industry within it's beyond just publishing, but through the whole research life cycle that you might find and your colleagues might find really interesting. You can go down a rabbit hole when you start exploring this, but yeah, like Stephanie said, talk to people, find out where they are, and there may very well be scholars even on campus who are investing their time in some of these things. It would be great if you could have a community of folks across campus who are exploring or even building tools, doing all kinds of things to help make their work more open.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
If I can ask another question or two. Stephanie, you'd mentioned the transformative agreements that Cambridge has with various institutions, libraries, that kind of thing. I wonder if you could just explain a little bit about that. And Charlotte had mentioned that, Cambridge has these clean, good, transformative agreements, but there might be other publishers out there whose transformative agreements are more problematic, let's say, for people. So if you could just talk about that terrain a little bit of what transformative agreements are. I mean, I think much of the audience here probably has a better sense than I do, actually, of that. I feel like I have some basic understanding, but if you could just describe that a little bit, and maybe related to that, are there significant differences in thinking about open access publishing for articles and article form scholarship versus books and book form scholarship, or is that a kind of continuous terrain?
So I'm happy to start here. So a transformative agreement is, in a nutshell, a combining sort of a read provision with a publishing provision, right? So saying that in the sort of before times, libraries would buy subscriptions to journals or packages, right, to journals, and those licenses for those packages of journals would say you can sort of read, you can access these journals, right? And so what a transformative agreement does is sort of add publishing to this equation and says not only can you read this content, but also you can publish into this content at no cost to your authors. So the authors are not seeing any sort of APCs. They're not paying article processing charges. Those are being covered by your library, by the institution. So I'm trying to recall what the other question was.
But also, could you just indicate how Cambridge is handling this issue versus other places where it might be a little more
so I think
happy?
Sure. So I think the difference might be that in sort of our approach at Cambridge has been for transformative agreements to be as cost neutral as possible. So essentially, in every case where we are able to provide unlimited publishing to an institution at their existing spend level, we're doing that. There are some institutions where that's not possible, where their sort of publishing way outpaces their spend, and in those cases, we try to figure something else out. But in most cases, we're able to make transformative agreements cost neutral. I think that I think I sort of alluded to it before that, I think that for some commercial publishers, this sort of mixed economy of both APCs and transformative agreements um, and traditional subscriptions is a hard, it's a lot of revenue and it's a hard amount of revenue to walk away from, right? But I wonder if Charla has anything else to add about sort of competitors that I really can't speak to.
Right. Yeah. Because Lyrasis, we work with Cambridge. They're a wonderful partner we work with, and we actually love that deal with them because the way I view transformative agreements, they're a great way for institutions to serve their authors. So it becomes very local. What you're paying for is not for other authors outside of your institution to be able to publish. And that's where the challenge of that kind of agreement is, but it's a wonderful for the libraries who are participating with these publishers. It's often their entryway into supporting open access, and it's proving some local value in supporting their own scholars. So, but where others provide, where they're not equitable in the sense that unlike Cambridge, who isn't a they're a charity as they're defined in the United Kingdom, but they're not for profit. And so that neutrality piece is really important. They have the luxury of being able to be neutral, to meet libraries where they are, whereas the for-profit entities that especially have shareholders that they're having to appease, their incentive is different. They have to appease them. And that's their mission, is to do that. And so they use these agreements as revenue generators and trying to get even more money. And so it's an opposing mission alignment. It just doesn't fit, that's in my mind, commercial publishers, I don't see them as evil. They're just misaligned with how we should be doing things within the academy. And so that's a big piece of this, is that those publishers who are mission aligned it's a lot easier for them to meet their existing customers of the libraries and the consortia that they work with, and meeting them where they are, and with that, and trying, but in a sustainable way, so that they can continue to operate. And so that's why they're not giving big discounts necessarily to get less money, because then they can't do what they've been doing all along. And so it's about a more equitable distribution of money. And so at Lyrasis, we're trying really hard to make all of the agreements that we're doing in this area much more like what we have with Cambridge, because that's sustainable for everyone.
And can I just ask you about that second part, about whether there's a difference between the open access publishing terrain for article form scholarship versus book form scholarship? And what I have in the back of my mind is a platform like JSTOR, which feels like it's the existence of the platform has allowed it to incorporate more and more books into that format in a way that didn't seem to be, at least in my recollection, there many years ago. And so whether these things converge together and can build off of each other, or whether they seem like separate kinds of terrains with separate kinds of issues about open access publishing.
I will say yes, and both. So books, books are like this, they're this awkward stepchild within. It's awful, and it's because books are different. Books are labs. Books are labs where scholars get to work for lengths of time and being able to think through things, and it's especially that long form monograph, right? And they're necessary for especially humanities. And it's just It's just part of how those disciplines function. And I don't ever see those going away. But because they're longer, they are usually with a single author, and they require specialized support from publishers and editing and getting them from the beginning to the end, especially that end, that it requires a lot of labor, which means they're a lot more expensive. And so whenever we talk about like author processing charges, I don't remember what the latest is on the average APC that's out there. It's like probably 2,500, 2,000, something like that. Although there are some journals, it's upwards of 11,000 per article. And there are some that are cheap or even free, right? Within books, cheap for a book processing charge, because those exist. Whenever a scholar wants their book to be published open access, they might be asked, okay, can you pay the cost for that? And it's anywhere I've seen as low as around $4,000, but some of them can be even like $20,000, $30,000 for a book. And it's because of the labor. Publishing is a labor issue. We have to take that into account. This isn't about technology that's easy to push buttons and that you're paying a subscription. It's about that hourly wage and the cost of the people who have to do this. So books are much more labor intensive. That said, there are amazing open book programs out there that are not using BPCs, because asking an author to pay $30,000 for their book to be open, then we would have no open access books. Because there aren't, the NEH is not going to do that for everybody. They only do it for one. And so it's a matter of finding the right kind of model that fits that. And most of those are collective funding models where you ask libraries to support, like Cambridge or the University of Michigan or MIT. They have all these programs, and they're asked to pay, everybody this tiered price based on the type of institution and the size of the library, which is equivalent to the size of the library, not always, but what kind of institution they are. Are they doctoral granting or a liberal arts institution? Anyway, there's tiered pricing based on that, and everybody's charged the same in that. But if you get enough of them to do that, then the books can be made open, because there's a revenue threshold they're trying to meet to be able to say, we're going to publish our whole front list open, or we're going to do one book open at a time. Or like Jay's store, they have a model where it's embargoed for 3 years, but then once after that 3 years, they've raised enough money, they're able to make those books open. So there's a variety of models out there. I think they learn from each other. The books came later than the journals, as far as adopting open, but a lot of the same principles apply, but the costs are different. And the models for gathering that money, itself is different because of those higher level costs for titles.
I can also add some context about what we're doing at Cambridge around sort of open books. This is a complicated space, I think, for lots of publishers, as Charla sort of alluded to. We're doing a lot more open publishing with our books. I think we published over 100 open books last year, and we're experimenting in different ways to make this possible. The reason that it's sort of complicated for us is that, so one, our books program is big, right? So we publish about 1,500 monographs a year. That's a significant sort of front list size. We also have a very significant and sort of deep backlist, right? So we have about 50,000 books on our platform in the backlist. And so thinking about how to sort of approach this, we're sort of looking at different models to experiment with. So one of the models that we've started as a pilot we call Flip to Open. And essentially what that is just titles that the author has identified that they'd like to participate and that they'd like their book to eventually become open access. And basically we have this pilot tranche of titles that once once we sort of, and they're published sort of traditionally, but once they make it past a certain revenue threshold point, we flip them to open access. We have moved past the pilot period and now have a second tranche in the works. And so it's successful. It's quite limited at this point, right? And so that's one way of sort of approaching it. We also are looking at institutional models, right? So trying to combine sort of thinking about it in a sort of read and publish kind of way, sort of combining access models with open access provision. This is, I think, to be honest, a little more complicated because sort of the book's landscape is different than the journal's landscape. And so sort of cost neutrality is just not possible when it comes to books. We're talking, and as Charlotte laid out, the cost of publishing a book is pretty high. I think our BPC is £13,000. And that's a lot of money for lots of folks. Maybe not unsurprisingly, though, we do have many authors who choose to publish their books open, and are coming up with either coming up with those BPCs themselves through grants, or they're getting the money from their institutions. And so right now it really is sort of a mixed bag, how a lot of books are going open. And we're trying to sort of navigate and find a way to sort of make more openness more possible for more authors.
Yeah, and I'll add one other challenge is how institutions buy content. And they do that through the libraries, and the libraries traditionally have had their budgets divided up in various ways, but book budgets are always different than the journal budgets. And because often books are in support of humanities, social sciences, and then of course it supports STEM as well, but they're not necessarily as big. They don't necessarily, and they're not always stable. And especially when thinking about books and how they're often delivered to libraries and book packages, subscriptions, purchase. I won't go into all of the ways, but they're never mind open access. And so even though $13,000, or if I transfer that to US currency, even though that is not, that's a drop in a bucket of some library budgets, it has to be earmarked and available within that budget line. And so then the scholars going to their department or somewhere else, it's causing a disruption of the money flows. Open access has done that. Who's supposed to pay for what? That's the question that's been coming up more than anything that's complicating it. But there's also the one other thing that's different with books. Books have different incentives as well. There are a lot of awards. There are a lot of the reviews. All of that piece is not necessarily within that journal's realm. It's not necessarily been replicated as well in an open environment, which adds to the myth that the open books are not as good because they're not, up for the same awards as everyone else. I put a link in the chat here. Last several years, the ACLS has been participating in an open book prize that's been funded by the Arcadia Foundation. And they've been specifically focusing on disciplines like looking history, environmental humanities, and literary studies. I'm on their advisory board, and they're going to be announcing a new round, but they're expanding those disciplines. And so I encourage the scholars at GMU to look into this, talk to their publishers, because they're already published books, but you can look at the details of the award. But it's a way to incentivize and add that reward structure into the open access environment. But that's going to take more than just this one little award. I think that it's a start.
Thank you so much.
You're so welcome. I think we are actually at time, but I just wanted to thank both of you again so much for a fantastic discussion. If everybody in the Zoom chat can do like a round of applause virtually. We just thank you so
Meg.
Thank you. Thank you so much again for your time and your incredible thoughts on this incredibly complex topic. So we're really grateful. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. It's been great talking to you.
You too. All right. Thanks. Thank you all.